as luck would have it, in a way, we had a really important and first paper that was published just yesterday. And what this paper did was look at the total amount of deaths over a period of time, over 15 years or so. And then you get a very, very different number, right? They discovered that the number of deaths for an average United States tropical cyclone or hurricane is, as reported by the media, hundreds of times the number, the official number.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Climate Emergency Forum. My name is Regina, and I'm really glad to be with you, friends and family of the forum, after a break that I just couldn't escape from. School really is just keeping me so busy, so I appreciate all of your support from everyone out there, and I really welcome you to this special show, Hurricane Helene, Untold Death and Destruction. And indeed, we put Untold in the title because we're not going to hear the actual numbers, because it may in fact be impossible to hear all of the numbers. It may take years of study to get a true grip on what has happened due to Hurricane Helene. Please understand that, of course, I know that you, friends of the forum, are following the information in the news. But what you're going to hear, and especially as it relates to death, the death counts, and it's so gruesome. I hate to use that word, but it's just not going to be accurate right now. In fact, I think maybe Paul will speak to this, or perhaps Peter. Those numbers are going to be so much higher. They're going to be referred to as like externalities, and it is just going to balloon. And this is something that we haven't seen in such a long time. There have been incredible storms. I mean, we all know that the storms in New York City, Hurricane Sandy, Hurricane Harvey in Houston. This is the one to beat all storms. Now, one of the things that really peeves me, and I guess I can say this as an American, is the various lobbies and the industries in this country that fight against common sense regulation in the name of the almighty dollar, which of course has been replaced as our religion in this country. We all kneel before the dollar. Well, there are real estate companies in North Carolina that have fought against government imposed or government recommended regulations that houses built on steep slopes should be anchored well into the mountain. Well, apparently that's too costly, and these home builders don't want to incur these extra costs. They want to build as cheaply as possible to increase those profit margins. Well, when people bought these affordable homes on the side of the mountain with the beautiful view, what do you think they woke up to with Hurricane Helene? A hell of a view of mudslides. Their homes just going straight down the mountain. That's what they have now. Now, of course, the builders get to maintain their profits. It's the people who have put their life savings into buying these homes that have lost everything. Now, don't kid yourself into thinking that they'll be made whole by flood insurance, especially since in most areas, less than 1% of people had home flood insurance. And interestingly enough, a lot of people didn't even know that they didn't have it. They just completely weren't aware. They just figured, well, I have home insurance. That's it. I'm covered. It's not the case. Flood insurance is an additional rider that you need to purchase to protect your home. So these people who sunk their savings into these paradisical homes are left high and dry. Now, those who do have flood insurance, they're not going to be made whole because the flood insurance is generally to help you get on your feet, but not to replace your home. So there's going to be a lot of rude awakenings. Now, of course, there is a lot of reasons that we can say that Hurricane Helene happened. Of course, the Gulf has been warming tremendously. Let me tell you, as someone who spent her childhood swimming in Galveston, that Gulf, when I was a kid, is mighty warm. Bathtub warm is what my dad used to say. Much hotter now. We know that these warm waters are fueling the power of these storms. As our atmosphere warms up and the oceans draw down the greenhouse gas and becomes more and more burdened, it's going to get warmer and warmer. These storms are going to get stronger and stronger, and we need regulations. Stop this insanity. And I'm now going to pass this on to Dr. Peter Carter. Peter, what do you have to say about Helene?
Thanks very much, Regina. That was very interesting. Actually, I wasn't aware of that about the flood insurance, and that's really important. So this tends to come down to numbers. We're at 200 people who have been killed by this unprecedented disaster in the United States. I think it's very important, though, and the media does mention not to become desensitized to the human anguish and agony that no numbers, of course, can describe. And actually, one of the media did mention that it's impossible to appreciate the amount of suffering, human suffering that this has caused. Now, to me, it's very important to notice that because this is due to the fossil fuel industry. So we're looking at devastated towns and regions, devastated families, and it's due to the fossil fuel industry. I do appreciate that the head of FEMA on her initial statement said very directly that this is a global heating, unprecedented disaster. So thanks for that. So to the numbers. First of all, I just want to read out the IPCC on the hurricane situation. As with most things on climate change nowadays, if you go into Google and look around at all the papers and opinions, you will get confused. So the sixth assessment of the IPCC said, quote, there's a record number of North Atlantic tropical storms, hurricanes, and Category 5 hurricanes since 1970. So that's pretty definite. The IPCC also mentions, quote, warming of the surface waters of the Gulf of Mexico has had an increasing impact on our climate. Obviously, they're talking at this stage about the regional climate. As luck would have it, in a way, we had a really important and first paper that was published just yesterday. And what this paper did was look at the total amount of deaths over a period of time, over 15 years or so. And then, and this was a very good paper, and then you get a very, very different number, right? They discovered that the number of deaths for an average United States tropical cyclone or hurricane is, as reported by the media, hundreds of times the official number, which is the immediate deaths that, I mean, people are still looking for and still finding bodies. Of just a horrendous, unbelievable thing to think about. So several hundred times is the actual death rate. This really reinforces the suffering that a disaster like this imposes on a community. In many senses, people never will get over such a disaster. So they come up with all told that, and they did the research since 1930, that United States hurricanes have contributed up to 5 million deaths since 1930. And the really interesting thing is that they compare this with other big causes of death, like infectious diseases, like motor vehicle accidents, and it's double and 3 times the number of those deaths. So this has really changed everything about the way we look at hurricanes. and particularly in view of the fact that this particular paper interestingly discovered that there was an increase in deaths around 2001. And they looked into this, and this coincided with an increase in the American hurricanes. So the final thing I do want to mention is that the research a couple of years ago found that, yes, definitely, rapid intensification of these hurricanes is increased. It's actually doubled. So that's a very definite research point and absolutely crucial.
Thank you so much, Peter. And thank you for speaking to something very important, which is the suffering of these communities, the long-term suffering. There's so much psychological trauma that these people go through. PTSD is very, very real. We've seen this after Hurricanes Alicia and Andrew. And again, the numbers of alcoholism, drug addiction, even suicide goes up in these areas that have had these horrible, horrible weather events. So I'd like to turn that over to Paul and hear, I know that you've done some research on this as well. I'd like to hear what you have to say, Paul.
Yes, thank you. So a couple of key points about this hurricane. AccuWeather is now estimating damages up to $160 billion. And just to put that in perspective, if it did reach that figure, that would be in the top 5 or 6 costliest disasters ever on our planet, according to the statistics. And, that's about a fourth or a fifth of the US military budget each year. We're talking about huge amounts of damages from the one storm. What was unique about this storm is the amount of water that it carried. For every degree Celsius of global warming temperature increase, we get 7% more water vapor in the air, and that water vapor rises and condenses into droplets, forming clouds, and can carry huge, much more water. So it was a water event, especially inland in rugged terrain, in mountainous regions, which is why it caused so much damage, because the rivers all overflowed and took out communities along them. It's already been mentioned, and quite often, that sea surface temperatures are extraordinarily high in the Gulf of Mexico, pushing 30 degrees Celsius. Anything above 26.5, and you get big amplification of storms. So 30 Celsius or 86 Fahrenheit, water temperatures are higher than that. So these storms basically have tremendous amounts of energy fueling them from the warm water, and they're larger size. So because they're larger size and the geometry of the bay where it struck Florida, the water just got piled up and created that 15-foot storm surge. Also, these storms, we're getting more of these large storms in the US, particularly because the jet stream configuration has changed. The air circulation patterns have changed. We're getting more of the storms have pushed up into the Gulf of Mexico than before because of the jet stream changes. Peter mentioned the paper, which is a new paper. It's been in the works for a long time, but the authors didn't believe their own results initially, so they had to confirm it with multiple other computer simulations and studies, etc. But basically, it's a statistical study, and they looked at what they call excess mortality in populations. So they looked at, I think, over 500 tropical cyclones between 1930 and a few years ago. Most of them, the average, I think, was 24 direct deaths. But they found that over the subsequent 15 years of the study, they saw a rise in excess mortalities, which kind of peaked at about 6 or 7 years after the storm and then dropped down, kind of symmetric. So what's causing these? I mean, the deaths we're talking about is huge. It's about 2 to 3%, something like that, of all deaths occurring in that particular region. But they've correlated it to these storms. So it's regions that get hit by these storms where people are affected. They have to rebuild. There might be toxic waste strewn over the landscape, which can be negatively affecting people's health, or it could be the massive stress that comes from losing your home and your entire community and having to rebuild. There's a lot of different possible factors which cause the result, and those this is the first study looking at this. So there will be other subsequent studies trying to tease out, what the actual and most important factors are in causing these excess deaths. And then maybe they can try to mitigate it and lower it in the future. But as Peter mentioned, the number of excess mortalities over 15 years following the tropical cyclone in the US is anywhere from 7,000 to 11,000 deaths over 15 years. And if you compare that to the 24 direct deaths reported, you're talking about ratios of 3 to 400 to even close to 500 times. And think about all the economic impacts over 15 years following the storm. I mean, we talk about 160 billion damage to Helene. That's the damage, that's immediate damage to rebuild roads, infrastructure, all the rest of it, houses. So if you consider the deaths and the impacts on society over 15 years subsequent, that's a huge factor. And I'm sure this paper will stimulate a lot more discussion. Basically, the bottom line is that climate change is causing us huge economic penalties in our society today. I've mentioned about how the inflation rate is higher, how goods costs are more expensive. And ironically, none of this sort of information, none of this is discussed in the media, especially during election cycles.
Well, I want to thank you for bringing up those issues. This is what we see. This is what we've always seen since the emergence of an industry that focuses on fossil fuels, and that is privatize the profits, socialize the losses. And of course, everyone's running around trying to salvage their lives. And then the rest of us who believe that we're not affected or just trying to stay above water with everything else that's going on, we're all just doing our best just to get by. And we've already spoken to some of the horrible outcomes, which is, of course, the loss of life, the physical injuries that people are going to face are going to be tremendous. But what about displacement and homelessness? These people right now are a cutoff. They're cut off from, a lot of them are cut off from help. So they're relying on each other as best they can. Right now, everyone's being neighborly and, oh, you can sleep on my couch. We'll have to see how long that's going to last when Uncle Joe smoking bothers, the neighbor who's on his sofa and he's like, well, like it or lump it. Arguments start to ensue. The whole thing it's just a very, very difficult situation. Food and water insecurity and economic hardships. But here's another thing. What about education? These kids are supposed to be in school right now. It's fall. School just started not too long ago. They're not going to school. Their educations are being disrupted. And as Peter said, a lot of these people will never get over what this storm has wrought. Many kids may sit out the rest of the year. There's going to be a tremendous loss of learning that can keep them behind for the rest of their lives. We don't know. I want to also put in one thing, because I always do, and that is the human suffering is untold. Let's not forget about the non-human living beings that we share the planet with that don't have a voice, that no one ever seems to talk about or care about. They too are suffering. So there's enough suffering to go around. Am I right, Peter?
Yeah, Regina, and thanks very much for yet again reminding us of our kindred that live with us on this planet, on whom we ultimately depend. So yeah, it's practically important as well as morally important. The amount of water that was dropped on these communities is absolutely unprecedented. The number I read was up to 10 trillion gallons of water dumped on this region. But I also want to mention that we knew decades ago that this was going to happen, right? I mean, yes, we've got all these models, and yes, they're incredible. But decades ago, we knew, due to global surface heating and the increased water, that this was going to happen, right? And it's going to happen more and more and more. And that's what the IPCC tells us. So this happened at about 1.4 degrees C, this disaster, and there are disasters happening on pretty well equal scale, frankly, all over the world in other countries. and very much related to the increase in precipitation now. These torrents of water and flooding are just as bad, if not worse, than the unprecedented heat waves that we're getting, that we are still getting. San Francisco yesterday had its hottest temperature of the year, and we're in October. That is global heating. I'm calling it superheating nowadays. So I'm looking for the reason why we get trillions and trillions of gallons of water dumped on this region. And of course, this has happened at least a couple of times before in the United States. The science, approaches everything in a linear fashion. We get badly caught out. That's really rather misleading because by its very nature, climate change produces abrupt spikes. And this is one of those and a big one. So there was a paper I came across in 2019 that said instead of the 7% increase in water vapor, in the case of a tropical cyclone hurricane like this, it can go up to 17%. So this clearly really is what we saw in this tragedy, this unprecedented disaster called Hurricane Helene.
Paul, do you want to jump in?
Yes. So we knew this storm was coming a few days ahead of time. People were told that it was a life-threatening storm in Florida. There were cautions, on the expected path of the storm inland, with people being told you're going to get lots of rain, you might have to hunker down. But, the actual result of the storm, it knocked out power to over 4 million people. And the landfall was about a week. It was a week ago. It happened on Thursday. 1 week ago at 11:10 p.m. at night, I believe, was when the storm crossed into Florida. That day, the Thursday, it had increased in strength through the night and also through the day before it struck, from a Category 1 to a Category 4 storm. But that was also sort of projected a bit in advance. So people had some sort of warning. They thought the storm surge would be maybe, 15 to 20 feet, and it, reached at least 15 feet in Florida in many places. But because the water is so warm, these things they're moving up the scale from tropical cyclone, tropical disturbance to Category 1 all the way up to the high categories in just about a day, basically, which is extremely fast, and it makes it a lot more difficult to forecast. And this is, a result of the supercharged energetic atmosphere that we've created by increasing the temperatures. That increases the water vapor, it increases the energy content, latent heat energy in the atmosphere, makes these storms much more intense. It's why we talk about one of the biggest effects that we're seeing from climate is the increase in extreme weather events, the increase in the severity, the duration, the size of these storms, where they're striking, all of these different factors. And because we've really changed the chemistry of our atmosphere and oceans with the greenhouse gases, and we've changed the way that things are transported around the planet by the atmospheric air circulation patterns, the jet streams, and so on. So this is a world that we've created for ourselves. If you look at the costliest disasters in human history, I think the top four or five are things like earthquakes, massive earthquakes, nuclear reactors breaking down, like Chernobyl, the Fukushima, that earthquake, and so on is pretty high up there. But if you go, and I said this 160 billion would put this in about 5th or 6th place. And the other factor is that if you look further down the list, most of the other the costliest disasters are all you can all relate them to climate. Whether it be flooding in Europe or, hurricanes are on the list everywhere. But, there's also droughts that are on the list. There's floods in Europe. There's many other climate related events that are on the list. So we've really changed our home. We've changed the planet, and we're paying the consequences now. And not doing anything or doing very little to try to stop climate change, that would have been far cheaper if we'd already been working hard on the problem. But because we haven't, things are going to be far more expensive going forward. But it's still way cheaper to slow down and try to halt climate change than it is just to bear all these disastrous events.
Well, thank you so much, Paul. I mean, I agree 100%. Let's stop these disasters from happening in the first place. Let's prevent them from being so bad. And for God's sakes, let's stop the greedy builders and other greedy entities from making things even worse by saying, no, we're not going to mitigate. No, we're not going to make sure that this is safe in the case of a 100-year storm. We need to make sure that everything that we build from here on out is able to withstand the coming onslaught of the next Helene. And I want to thank you all for caring enough to watch this program. And I want to thank you all for being here with us today, because we look forward to seeing you next time at the Climate Emergency Forum. We'll see you then.